Hello and welcome back. Today's video, I'm very excited to be presenting you with. We will be discussing ideas from over 2,400 years ago, particular allegory from one of philosophy's greatest minds. And it's a very complex issue and idea that he had laid out. This is my fifth or sixth time attempting to cogently present my ideas so that it can make sense and we can learn together about the psychological and spiritual significance of such a profound thought. So, I will be reading some passages from the Republic. Particularly, we will be discussing the allegory of the cave. So, I'll begin with a little historical context. Then we'll lay out kind of the organizational structure of this work so we can contextualize it a little better because he was dealing with a lot of very complex ideas. So it's important to really appreciate the depth of these insights. So, without further ado, prepared some notes. So, the Republic was written in the 4th century BC. And this was a particularly tumultuous time in antiquity. The writing took place during the Peloponnesian War. So those were the two great city-states or polis states of Athens and Sparta. And the reason why Plato ultimately theorizes his perfect republic was because of the injustices that he saw around him. You had Sparta fighting for the oligarchy and Athens for democracy, although there were periods of political instability. His mentor and great friend Socrates was just exiled and murdered from Athens for corrupting the youth. And this catalyzed Plato's interest in hypothesizing what a real solution could look like in order to maintain integrity and stability and prosperity in a city state. So you also had at the time the rise of what was known as the sophists. And the sophists were a new movement who were trying to emphasize the necessity of learning persuasion techniques. So using deceptive tactics, being very duplicitous in their nature, simply to produce their selfish desires of influencing someone in a particular manner or achieving specific monetary gains or whatever their desire was. So Plato was also ardently opposing them and very passionately speaking of the pure forms of intellectual ideas. And so in the Platonic tradition, Plato understood that there were two sort of meta categories. There were the worldly things of which we perceive, of the sensory inputs, and then existing outside of it, there were forms, or the pure, real ideas and thoughts that existed outside of this temporal landscape. So now I'll just offer a brief outline. There's 10 books in total of the Republic. We won't be going through them all, but I highly recommend you can be edified if you approach it with an open mind and don't harp on some of the anachronistic terms, but simply try to integrate some of his really profound ideas into your conceptualization of today's modern moral landscape. That's ultimately what he was concerned with, morality and ethics. And so, in that vein, we start with the question in Book 1, what is justice? He goes through the dialogues, mainly the characters are Socrates and Glaucon. There's others mixed in there. And he tests the definitions and ultimately comes up with his ideal city, the Callipolis, as a model of the soul, arguing that justice is a kind of right order. So fitting in to the rationality aspect while understanding that the temporal sensory impulses of the world might not always fit into that schema. And then we move out of that's primarily books 1 to 4. Now we go 5 to 7, where he will defend his claim, very famous claim, that philosophers must rule the state, or the rulers must become philosophers. So this is, again, coming back to his ultimate understanding of knowledge is only attainable in the philosophical understanding. And maybe it would be helpful just to give you a brief definition of the etymology of philosophy. It simply means, from the Greek roots of it, the love of wisdom. So, how you can properly discern right from wrong, good from bad, virtue from ambition. And it's no easy task to do that. And there's a reason why after so long we still rely, in some real sense, for some of the greatest analogies and metaphors and allegories ever created from some of these ancient thinkers. So, with that notion, with that premise that philosophers must rule, a number of questions arises. This deals kind of in the epistemological realm of the philosophy, the study of knowledge itself. So, what knowledge qualifies someone to be fit to rule? What is the highest thing to know? And what education gives rise to such a person who can acquire the necessary ethos or disposition to be fit to rule? Again, very deep questions. You can spend a long time thinking about it, but we have a lot of evidence now. We'll continue to unpack that, at least in certain ways, to discern what you shouldn't be learning and maybe which directions you could otherwise be looking in. So, books 7 to 10, book 7 is where we find the allegory. We are introduced with 3 images. The first is a picture of the highest object of knowledge. So that represents the aim, the ultimate virtuous goal to achieve, the pinnacle of any hierarchy of value. Then we go, secondly, to a picture of the levels of cognition, understanding the differences between mere opinion and genuine knowledge. And then we are finally met with the allegory of the cave. So I'm just going to leave out here some questions, lay out some questions here that might aid in guiding you before I read just a few number of the passages to give you the ideas of what his authentic words were. So we'll be discussing ideas such as What does it mean to simply react to the reflection of reality which we perceive from an isolated viewpoint? How do we know that we're in an isolated viewpoint? What happens when we remove the theory of the mind from our conceptualization? Another great question. How shallow can our vision be of life itself? How far removed can we be from actually incorporating all of the necessary elements to guide our behavior? Does that reality even constitute life itself if you do not, whether by naivety or ignorance, if you do, whether by naivety or ignorance, fail to integrate all other constituent elements of a proper mode of existence? And finally, when we fail to incorporate all of the complexities that are intrinsic to genuine being, what sort of ontological and epistemological framework are we bounded by? Do we even possess the ability to contemplate those issues under the circumstances of a profane life in the modern articulation of things? So I'll begin now with this is the opening of this specific section. So here is Socrates in Plato's dialogue. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Okay, so a few things to unpack there. Notably the chain, so the inability for these particular viewers to be able to move and to see what's actually going on around them. And all that they are perceiving in this theoretical life is the shadows that are cast on the wall, which are guided by the marionette players in his analogy here. So a way of interpreting this in today's world is I draw immediately to Foucault's articulation of the panopticon, which is this all-seeing and all-guiding surveillance state which dictates all of the prisoners' actions by means of confining them to only the narrow set of approved behavioral patterns. And it's a very scary thought, but when we recognize that today, most of what people use as the means to think are presented on this. And not a lot of thought, unfortunately, goes into what it is about the sources of the information, but simply by means of recognizing popularity, or if you're interested in a particular niche of things, the algorithms have gotten nearly perfected their ability to radicalize your interest in whatever it is that they are observing you to engage with. And the question you have to ask yourself is, which shadows are being cast in front of you? Which influencers are you spending your time watching? What music are you consuming? What shows are you spending your time on a nightly or weekly basis, whatever it is, participating in that viewing? And unfortunately, in a nearly purely secularized world, especially in the modern mainstream media landscape, a lot of these creators and artists and influencers aren't being driven by anything other than avarice. So they'll compromise any genuine ethical framework to dictate their actions just simply because of the purely monetary efficacy of their labor. It's horrifying to see the hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions, that have been made since the legalization of gambling, the advent of OnlyFans, and just the continued propagation of pornography in itself. It's disturbing to look at the actual numbers in studies of teenage boys who are admitting to being exposed to these things from absurdly young ages, sometimes under the age of 10. And recognizing that these aren't trivial matters, especially at those young ages when your brain is so plastic, it's so malleable. And we know this now, we learn a lot from imitation. So when you're watching an influencer partake in these gluttonous habits or just unethical ways of capturing your attention, to some degree, the viewers will follow suit because, well, that's what's applauded. That's what's valued, at least in this secular sense of things, over all the other content that's being made. And it's really pernicious. It's a death cycle loop, especially with the algorithms, because Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt were discussing what they articulated as the race to the bottom. And essentially, we saw it first with TikTok, the short form content took precedent over everything else. So then what happened shortly after? Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, and likewise, other platforms are trying to follow suit with it. Now, I'm not saying it's inherently an evil thing for people to cut up certain parts of their creation into smaller forms. Absolutely not. I'm saying the substance, what's actually being viewed and created, is is poisonous. It, it's that it's that simple. And the United States will, as we're seeing the developments in other legislation reflecting the fact that other governments are well aware of these pernicious aspects to these platforms, and you have many cases internationally where there are either limits from the ages that these children can access these platforms, And you also have examples, like in China, of specific limits of the actual time that people can spend on it. I mean, there's disturbing studies proving that average teenagers confess they spend 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day on their phone. And it's the race to the bottom. I mean, you're seeing this whole new wave of streamers who just jump from one clickbait activity to the next. And then, again, I'm not saying there's zero entertainment value, but you have to understand that uh, at those ages, it is imperative for the kids and the parents and the peers around them, older cousins or whatever it is, to tell them maybe you shouldn't be watching so and so, or maybe you shouldn't be watching them this much. Maybe there are other more educational platforms, or even just actual quality media being put out there that isn't one of the top buzzwords of 2025 of brain rot. It's sure you can just simply laugh at it, or you can say, holy crap, we might have a psychological epidemic on our hands. And we might be witnessing the swelling of these currents. And what happens when they continue to accumulate, it's not a pleasant thought to sit with. So now we'll go into a little bit more of how we can understand of what the truth is, where it exists, and how we can attain it. Again, Socrates. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort. And when seen, is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth, and the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally either in public or private life must have his eye fixed. Now, a number of formulations in the Christian faith immediately come to me, and recognizing that there's an intrinsic order, the logos, such a profound idea, in that you can only see through an effort. And in the spiritual understanding, that is the struggle we all voluntarily enter into. It's been said that the road to hell feels like heaven, and the path to heaven feels like hell. And it's a reduced version, but well, when you think about it, there's a reason why there's a flaming sworded cherubim, guardian angel, guarding the gates of heaven, and that were barred from the original fall of man. You have to recognize that it's intrinsic to the order of life that we discriminate and we value different ideas and customs above others. That's what gives rise to identity. That's what forms cultures. That's what allows for the abundant propagation of a people and a civilization. And in that pursuit, you will enter into it with a struggle. That's the spiritual struggle. That's the understanding that even though this device can provide me with whatever I want immediately, right now, I can abdicate all of my responsibilities, worry about none of the problems that are around me, not focus on focusing on bettering myself, but heeding to the whims of my carnal appetites and desires. There's nothing more ignorant and there's nothing more incompetent than that line of reasoning. And most people don't do it, again, because in this analogy, we are metaphorically bounded. We cannot turn, we cannot see behind us who is playing these strings, who is casting these shadows. And well, we have to understand that our Redeemer came in the world not to be served, but to serve. And he came not to be crowned with gold and diamonds, but with a crown of thorns, to be scorned, spit on, ridiculed, mocked, and crucified for the redemption of humanity, his own creation, the Logos incarnate. That is the pattern of behavior that we are meant to aim at. That is the ultimate. There is no higher conceptualization of the good, of the eternal, of the Logos. So, again, we need to consistently remind ourselves that we have certain inclinations to feed the worldly desires, to just sit down, watch the damn puppet show, turn on the TV, scroll for hours, forget about everything that you could be. And in the depth psychology understanding of it, the psychological understanding is that's the return to the initial state of undifferentiated chaos. That's the Ouroboros. If you've ever seen the image of the dragon with itself eating its own tail in the circle, that's the regression. And that's the cyclical nature. And knowing that we can theorize all of these virtuous ways, and to put it plainly, a lot of philosophers talk about living great lives, and then you reflect on their actions and see their true character, and it's not reflective of it. That's why Christ was so vociferously attacking the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. It's an archetypal impulse for us. It's, in the modern psychological understanding, it's cognitive dissonance, Leon Festinger's theory. The further separated the idea of where and who you want to be and where and who you are now, the further apart those things are separated, the more dissonance, the more disunity, the more chaos, the more unnecessary suffering. Suffering is intrinsic. You have the choice of which challenges you are going to choose if you get your life in order. If you stop abdicating your responsibility, if you shut your phone off and think on a nightly basis in prayer, if I was everything that I could be, who is that person? And you should seriously ask yourself that every day of your life. And if I was seriously committed to becoming that person, what are the steps that I should be taking in order to attain that goal, that ultimate aim? St. Athanasius formulated a very, very famous idea that God became man so that man may be deified. Christ came into this world. The Father so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son to be held up and to be crucified so that we can witness this and learn and understand the only proper way to aim, the ultimate aim. There's a ridiculous injunction in Exodus when the Israelites, being led by Moses, are constantly turning back and wishing they could be bounded back in slavery because there were periods where they had no water. They were in a sojourn in the desert. They were journeying through the desert, seeking the promised land. And instead of immediately providing the material goods that they wanted, God sends a plague of venomous snakes on them. And when Moses intercedes for the people, asks, how do I stop this atrocity that I'm witnessing? God commands Moses to build a bronze staff with two of the serpents. And that's the bronze serpent. That's still the symbol of the medical domain. That's the healing property associated with that symbol. So there will always be those venomous snakes around you. You'll always be tempted to revert back to the means of your initial unconscious awareness, coming to awakening, understanding there's a lot of things that need attention in this world. And if you're only going to serve your narrow, self-minded whims, the more unnecessary suffering that will inevitably manifest in itself. And the only antidote to that for the Israelites was to stare upon that bronze serpent in fear. And that was how they were able to proceed on their journey from there. That was the cure. And that is the Christ that prefigures Christ on the cross, on the crucifixion. It's such a incredible typological narrative, the prefiguring of the Messiah. And it's important to note as well that the pattern of redemption and transformation, you don't go from the bounds of your slavery, of the chains in the cave, straight to the light. As well, in Plato's articulation, when the prisoners are released, hypothetically, they are so conditioned to what they had seen that their eyes cannot bear witness to the true, in his understanding, the forms of the pure light. And in the same way, the Israelites are turning back. And it's not immediately that they enter into the promised land. Moses doesn't even make it into the promised land because he sins against God. And instead of using the proper words which God commanded him to speak to the rock to provide water for the people, he strikes it with his rod, uses his anger, his compulsive nature. And for that reason, Joshua, the next in line, was the one to lead them into the promised land. So it's the slavish nature, the bounded nature, into the desert. You're venturing into the unknown. You're out of chaos, but you're in the unknown. And now you need to map things out. And you'll have multiple encounters. You'll be delivered the 10 Commandments, the ethical framework that gave rise to the Israelite nation. And guess what happens the first time that they're given it? During the 40 days that Moses goes up the mountain to receive them, Aaron, the first priest and right hand to Moses, hears the cries of all of the peoples, and they come together, gather all their gold jewelry, and build a golden calf and indulge in the old sensory pleasures, the orgiastic festivals, the belligerent drinking and nature. And when Moses comes down the first time, he smashes the tablets. And they repent and they understand how fallen their nature was, how terrible this is. And he goes back again, another 40 days of fasting and waiting to receive the second tablet. And one could argue that the first articulation, the first formulation of those ideas could have been different in whatever degree we won't know. But again, the degree of dissonance is going to affect your ability to perceive and then conceive of the world, of reality itself. And that's again paralleled in this understanding. And so also to Plato, when the one who is unbounded, when the philosopher goes out into the light and trains himself and enters into that necessary struggle, when he comes back and he tries to free the bounded prisoners who are, again, only seeing the shadows, they are ridiculed, they are mocked, they are scorned, anathematized. That's the pattern. You can't accept the truth. You can't handle the truth when you are guided by the dictates of someone who's manipulating your reality. And we have to understand that there's no greater form of casting those damn shadows than this. There's no greater power for someone who is acting by guidance of their vanity and by their avarice and by their greed. Reality isn't predicated on power. The secular conceptualization, that's as far as they've gotten so far, or that technology should be the guiding principle of any new legislation. It should be reflected in the importance of catalyzing that innovation at the cost of everything. I mean, I'm no environmentalist, but it's insane to me to even fathom the fact of how much erosion is taking place as a result of the development of AI with all the data centers, how much computational power is necessary, what's next with the quantum computing, which they're spending an obscene amount of money on to develop and to enter us into Web3. No more ones and zeros. We're in superpositions. And I see none of it. At least what's ultimately lauded are the innovators, the technocrats who will exploit at their whim. And in their attempt, clearly they are not aiming at the right thing. They do not have the highest ideals in mind. Or at least they're not considering what else should be placed above what they're conceptualizing. I'm not saying we need to stultify innovation, but we need to contemplate what the implications of not coming to a consensus on which assumptions these new systems are going to be built off of. Because we've already had proof that the AI systems that are accessible to the public have aided in producing criminal activity and to allow people to produce the means of destruction. And that's just one domain. Another disgusting idea is the recent data that just came out of Grok and its ability to generate images based off of any picture. And knowing how much disgusting creations are being made just to serve the appetites. And it's like, yeah, that's not me. Well, it can be. And those people, when they were growing into these things, I'm sure that's not exactly what they had envisioned, but you become conditioned, you become desensitized. It's a topic I'm going to be spending a lot of time drawing out. And you can attain that pleasure at the expense of humanity itself. What the secular ideologies have produced. I mean, the W path files, and thankfully we're seeing a reversal of those procedures being allowed, but knowing how many children were mutilated and sterilized in the name of justice and inclusivity, it's horrifying. It's horrifying. Those people who were advocating for these beliefs need to be reprimanded. They need to be held accountable. And we need to make sure that the next generation understands that these are discussions that might not be happening and are honestly suppressed at the institutional level. Many of my peers were driven to write on specific topics in particular manners to appease the teacher, the professor who's no professor at all. I've had plenty of bouts producing real work of real quality in content, and I was literally mocked and wrongfully, unjustly graded. I received poor grades knowing that there was a high chance, but I still believed in the idea that maybe they were after genuine education. Maybe if you don't agree with it, you can still find the substance, the quality of the articulation and how I'm formalizing ideas. But no. And most people don't stand up to that. And we need to. There's no difference between the triumph of evil and the silence of the good. There's none. We know what happens in totalitarian regimes of the 20th century when an absurd amount of the population become informants on their own family and own friends to gain favor in the eyes of the state. We need to know these things, and we're not taught them, or we don't have these discussions. They're not encouraged. But we need to understand what can happen if these next developments go terribly wrong, and we've already seen such horrible examples of it, and their ability to cast the shadows and dictate our actions by decree of their beliefs. And they'll try to hide it in the upper realms. I've attacked Nussbaum's ideas of we need to approach a new method of conceptualizing the ethical frameworks from a non-sectarian manner. And it's just so wrong. You have to set assumptions. Thinking is discriminatory. We think so that our ideas die, and we don't. So I'm going to finish up now with one last passage. This is at the end of it. Again, Socrates to Glaucon. Well, I said, and you would agree that what has been said about the state and the government is not a mere dream, and although difficult, not impossible, but only possible in the way which has been supposed, that is to say, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, one or more of them, despising the honors of this present world which they deem mean and worthless, esteeming above all things right and the honor that springs from right, and regarding justice as the greatest and most necessary of all things, whose ministers they are, and whose principles will be exalted by them when they set in order their own city. There's a reason in the Christian tradition we say that the blood of the martyrs fertilizes the soil of our faith, because their examples following the broken and crucified Christ, many times tracing throughout every century the persecutions that they faced, and when they were met with the tyrants who oppressed them, they didn't shy away. They voluntarily accepted those sacrifices, and we need to look to them for inspiration. And understanding that if a teacher is going to try to persuade me to speak on a particular topic in this specific way, I am going to formulate my own ideas. I'm going to consider what they're saying. I'm not telling you to operate in a vacuum. You have to read your opponents. There has to be free speech and understanding all the different elements of it. And you learn in the classical Enlightenment articulation of that, that's what bolsters your own damn argument. And when you think, if you actually want to formulate something with some veracity and some formidability, you don't spend majority of the time thinking of how to make it more praiseworthy. You attack your own ideas from as many voices as you can possibly come up with. You go into the theory of the mind of the other camps of thought, and you use that to integrate it into your conceptualization. And so again, when the philosophers try to explain the light after they are freed and after they condition themselves to the real, to the pure, they're ridiculed, mocked, shamed, and we have to understand this in the contrast of what it is, the light and the darkness. And in John 3:19, we have a ridiculously clear understanding of this. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. So we really, again, have to consider that we need to carefully deliberate on these ideas. Are we brooding in the darkness? Are we just feeding our own avarice, our own narrow interest? Or are we attempting to become unself-conscious? Is there more that I could be doing? Is there a greater version of myself that I can be envisioning? And it is a painful process. I will tell you firsthand, I've had to remove majority of who I was from situations, from relationships, a number of ways, and many nights truly facing the reality of my own ignorance, praying for redemption, that I may, as Christ says, you must be transformed in order to perceive. His conversation with Nicodemus, you must be transformed. That transformation process is painful. That's the struggle. That's you being unbounded and going out into the world and seeing the pure light. And it'll make you aware of your own inadequacies and what needs to be changed about your behavior and about the manner in which you perceive the world as a result of that. And that is the good struggle. That is the only way forward to ameliorate all of these disturbing atrocities. And so John 3:20, right after that, everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. Jordan Peterson makes this remark a lot, that in his personal practice, not one person has gotten away with a single thing, ever. You can lie to yourself for so long, you can grow in so much dissonance, it will come out, the flood will come, and you will be faced with the reality of your actions. Christ says not one tiny pen stroke will pass away until the heaven and earth passes. Recognize that the manner in which you choose to behave now matters on a cosmic level. You are a microcosm of reality, born in the image of God, made to come into communion with the Messiah, with the Redeemer. And this is the way forward. Thank you for listening.